Hello and welcome to Denny Abbey. This tour intends to give you an introduction to the history of the Abbey and some of the more interesting features of the site. From the entry kiosk, please walk along the track towards the Abbey and through the gate. This will be the first stop of the tour. You should now be at point 1, as shown by a marker on the gate. If you look towards the Abbey, you will see the signs of 850 years of history, a mixture of brick and stone and concrete, of differently shaped windows and doors, some blocked off, others superimposed on originals, a confusing mishmash of styles and materials. Perhaps you can think of what you see now as a palimpsest, like one of those medieval parchments that has been partly erased so that it can be written over. Something too valuable to be thrown away, and so it must be reformed and reused in a different idiom. This is hardly surprising, for building stone is not to be found in this part of Cambridgeshire, and a building such as Denny has always been seen as far too good to pull down or allow to crumble. You should be able to make out 3 sections to the Abbey from where you are now standing: left, central and right. The central one is the most helpful to begin with, as it is the original east-west nave of the first church. The west door is the one you can see at the near end of this central section. Just below the roof of this section you should be able to make out 2 rounded clear-story windows, one almost obscured by a later window. These, too, are original. The left-hand section is the transept, or crossing, of the first church, and you are looking at the north end. The faint outline of a blocked-up clear-story window can just be seen on the west face of this transept, at a similar level to those in the nave. What seems to be a large window halfway up the north face of the transept is, in fact, a door which led into a 2-storied building whose upper floor housed the dormitory, or sleeping quarters. For, of course, an abbey was a self-sufficient community whose inmates lived here for much of their lives. You may be able to make out the outlines of 2 earlier doors which once led into the same building, as well as marks of its lower roof line. Between you and the building you can see the remains of various monastic buildings, perhaps an early refectory, a cellarer's building, a storehouse, though there is disagreement over the exact location of each. The founders of this abbey were a cell of Benedictine monks attached to Ely Cathedral, just 10 miles away. Exactly why they chose to come here is not entirely clear. It's possible that their previous quarters, a mile or so to the north, were flooded out, and so they decamped to one of the few islands in the fens. Or it may be that they came in search of solitude, to escape the temptations of the big city. At any rate, they began building in 1159, from the east end, and got almost as far as the end of the central section by 1170, when they, equally mysteriously, left, to return to Ely. In truth, they must have had a difficult time of it. Denny was surrounded by water for much of the year, and so cannot have been healthy. Stone for the abbey had to be brought from Northamptonshire over 50 miles away, probably by waterway, which would have been expensive and time-consuming, and during this period the monks would have had to live in temporary, uncomfortable accommodation. However, if you look to the nearest fields to your right, you may see evidence that they were not the first to see the benefits of this site. You may be able to see the remains of a causeway that runs through the car park and bends round to continue towards Waterbeach, a mile away to your right. In the field you can still make out the bumps and mounds of Romano-British farmsteads, more of which can be found in fields to the south of the Abbey. The road you came along to get here, the A10, is a Roman road, which would have linked the cities of Ely and Cambridge, as it still does, so the site was not as isolated as it may first appear. Please go across now to the west door of the church, to point 2 of the tour. You should now be standing by the west door of the church. In 1170, the abbey was sold to another religious organisation, the Knights Templar. Although officially named the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ, and set up with a simple aim of protecting Christian pilgrims en route from Jaffa on the Mediterranean coast to Jerusalem, by 1170 this organisation had become the richest and most powerful body in Christian Europe, with armies, navies, castles, a diplomatic service, a banking network, huge swathes of land throughout the continent, and headquarters in the centres of Paris, London and Jerusalem. In England they owned numerous estates, or preceptories, which were geared to furthering their economic interests, but Denny was selected as one of only 2 properties to serve as a hospice for elderly and sick members of the order. When they arrived, the west front, where you are standing, would probably have been an empty shell. The Benedictine design had called for a much longer nave, but the Templars had a more realistic view, and they closed off the end with the decorated doorway that you see before you. If you look up, there was probably a window where the brickwork is now, to let in light at this end. Most of the stone ancillary buildings, whose remains you can see around you, were built by the Templars, who remained here for another 135 years. In front of the west door, on the ground, is the outline shape of a coffin. The actual burial was discovered during excavations, and the bones of the unknown Templar now lie in a metal case in the education room. If you stand with your back to the west door, on your left is a small building with a blocked Gothic window and a cement-filled doorway, which was originally separate from the church. This may have been the house of the preceptor, the man in charge of the abbey, or possibly a guest house. Later it was joined onto the church. Please continue left around the outside of the building, past the modern entrance doorway to the south side, where you will see the next point in the tour, point 3. If you look at the building from this side, you will note that it looks nothing like a church, and indeed it isn't. By 1307 the Templars had overreached themselves, and the King of France, Philip the Fair, who was heavily in their debt, decided to move against them. The organisation was closed down on the grounds, possibly true, of heresy, and its leaders executed. In England, Edward II, son-in-law to Philip, felt it was wise to follow suit, and the 11 elderly and frail Templars at Denny were removed to Cambridge Castle and later to the Tower of London. Fortunately for them, Edward was more interested in seizing the lands and wealth of the Templars than in bothering about what crimes they might have committed, and so they were eventually absolved and pensioned off to live in other monasteries. Denny passed to the king, who offered it to a young and very wealthy widow, the Countess of Pembroke, founder of Pembroke College in Cambridge. Wanting to do and be seen to do good works, she decided to remove a group of Franciscan nuns, the Poor Clares, from Waterbeach to come and worship at Denny. It is said that it took her 10 years to persuade them to move the 1 mile, which may not say much for the attractions of Denny. However, the Countess was ambitious, and she had major plans for the abbey. The part you are looking at was added onto the south side of the nave in the 1340s, and was to become the guest quarters for those she would invite to stay with her, though the windows are much later. Other items of interest include the outline of a Gothic doorway at first floor level on the left-hand side of the building. This may have led into a wooden garderobe or toilet, as archaeologists have found the evidence in the ground underneath. The Countess also modernised the south end of the transept, converting it into her living quarters. The two thin windows you can see gave light to a spiral staircase, and the irregular rectangular window to their left illuminated her own private garderobe. Before moving on, note also the Tudor brick chimney which was built onto the south end of the transept and which will be referred to later. Please move now to the front, east end of the church, to point 4. You should now be at point 4. If you study this facade, you can begin to unlock the secrets of 850 years of English, religious, architectural and social history, all written into the stonework of the original crossing of the first church. Of course, something is missing, for there should be a choir or east end to this church, but all that remains is the thick concrete outline on the grass, together with a handful of clues on the face of the transept. The Countess of Pembroke decided that the existing church was not suitable for the 30 or so nuns she was intending to bring from Waterbeach, or, more likely, was not sufficiently large to befit a lady of her status, so she decided to build a much bigger church in its place. Rather than demolish the original structure, which would have been an expensive, time-consuming and wasteful exercise, she decided to use the transept as the west end of her new church. This meant taking down the choir of the first church, which accounts for why it is no longer there. She bricked up the lovely Norman semicircular archway of the first church, which can still be seen, as well as the two doorways either side into the transept. The right-hand one is visible behind the pillar. A new pointed Gothic doorway was inserted in its place to enable nuns to access the church from their dormitory. This gives us a clue as to the dimensions of the new church, which can be made out via the tram lines showing through the grass. We can tell it had 2 aisles, so it was much wider than the earlier one, but we are less certain as to its length and height, although the lintel, just below the top window in the blocked-up Norman arch, was apparently the site of an earlier window through which the Countess could look down on the nuns at their devotions, and so must have been within the new church. The existing church was then converted into private apartments for the Countess and for her guests. We know little about the Poor Clare nuns who lived there, except that it is highly doubtful that they were poor. Some, we know, owned land, and the last abbess, Elizabeth Throckmorton, was from a titled and well-connected family, who corresponded with the great Renaissance scholar Erasmus, and may even have had him to stay at Denny. The motivation for women to enter nunneries in medieval and Tudor times was not always religious, and some doubtless lived comfortable, though secluded lives. This ends part 1 of the tour. Please continue with part 2.